everybody. So thanks so much for joining us at the Go Local Live Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. I'd like to introduce John Davis. He is a pianist. And you are here because we are talking about Bambula, Black Music Before the Blues. I'm really looking forward to this. You have curated an exhibit at Brown, really talking about all different kinds of artifacts, music, and all different kinds of things. So before we get really into your background, because you have quite an extensive and exciting background, let's talk a little bit about Bambula and really how you put this together.
Well, this exhibition is something I proposed to Brown, and it's really an outgrowth of my own collection. Over the years, I've amassed this archive of rare printed musical African Americana from basically all the way from the late 18th century up to the early 20th century that is the source, the primary source material for my career as a pianist. And I grew up in Providence, actually sort of immersed in African American music and culture in addition to studying classical music. And at some point these two worlds came together for me, and at that point I decided to start amassing an archive of primary source material that would be both the music that I would eventually play, but also the visual material that I could also project in concerts. And it's incredibly lovely to look at this material, and also simultaneously appalling because it's a racially charged material. But over the last 20 years, I've amassed this material, and the John Hay Library at Brown also has one of the most respected collections of early American sheet music in the world, and so I thought it was a good melding of these two collections.
And what you've done is you've put together just some absolutely fascinating artifacts. Can you kind of walk us through what people will be able to see, because the exhibition is going on right now, and you have a symposium that you're speaking at on Tuesday the 11th if people are interested. And this is kind of a program walking us through. But can you tell us what people can go and see?
Well, essentially what the show is trying to do is trying to trace the pre-recorded history of African American music and its influence on the music that came later that we all know. The recorded music of, basically jazz, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll, as well as the influence of African American theater music on what became American theater in the 20th century, as well as radio and television. And so these artifacts trace that whole path of influence. And so it's broken down into various components. This involves both folk music as well as concert music as well as theater music. And so it begins at the sort of basically pre-Civil War folk music, which involves work songs and spirituals and all kinds of music that grew out of the African slave trade, and the first printed manifestations of that, and the first books on the subject, most of which didn't even actually come into print until after the Civil War. But we have several books that had many of these influences of spirituals and plantation music and even spoken word, which was a very important part of African American culture, and that is the roots of what I think became hip hop culture in America. Then there are numerous people who were the first concert musicians, stage performers that are highlighted. Among them is a woman named Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, who was probably the first well-known black vocalist who achieved a certain amount of renown in the 1850s. Another man named Francis Johnson, who was a bugle player and band leader in Philadelphia, who was probably the first well-known black musician. He wrote the first music published by an African American. And then a few people who are dear to my heart because I play their music, a guy named Louis Moreau Gottschalk of New Orleans, who was actually white, but wrote the first piece entitled Bambula, that is widely regarded as the first work ever influenced by African American culture. And then another person that he influenced.
I mean, that's pretty poignant.
Yes.
white artist who was influenced by an African American.
And in fact, one of the themes of the show is this sort of symbiosis between people of African descent who were operating in the colonies in the United States, and also the white people who were influenced by this music. And Gottschalk, who's from New Orleans, heard a bambula in Congo Square, which is the image here depicted on the cover of the catalog, and what that image, a scene similar to that image, influenced the writing of this first piece ever influenced by African American music. Some later people that he influenced was a guy named Blind Tom, who performed in Providence, who was...
He performed in Providence.
Yes,
Cool.
well, he performed everywhere, but Blind Tom is probably the first black superstar performer in America, and he was a slave, originally from Columbus, Georgia, who achieved incredible renown as a pianist, and Gottschalk even wrote about him in his published diary, which is also in the exhibit. And then a later figure named Blind Boone, who was from Missouri, who modeled his early career on Blind Tom's and eventually became a seminal figure in the ragtime movement that was germinating in the Midwest all around him, and also in the Kansas City big band movement associated with people like Count Basie that took hold in Kansas City in the 1910s and 20s. But these people were all the formative people in helping to create these sounds. Also, the exhibit covers theater music and that pariah of American show business, minstrel shows, which is a very important part, was really constitutes the beginning of American show business as we know it today, and fed into early film and black theater on Broadway, and some of the pioneering minstrel show figures, particularly black minstrel show performers, became some of the pioneering figures on Broadway. And a couple of people, a guy named Sam Lucas was one of them, who was one of the first people to make the leap from black minstrel shows into legitimate theater. And other people fed into a number of other people, like Burt Williams and George Walker, who were in the show called In Dahomey in 1903, that was probably the first really large-scale show that made it to Broadway that was completely written and performed exclusively by African Americans. So it sort of traces this whole path and the symbiosis going on between people of African descent and people of European descent in helping create the culture that we know as American show business today.
I mean, and it's just so fascinating that this has really been your life's work to not only get all of this, collect all of this, but to showcase it and to perform this music and to do it in kind of not only a classical way, but an upbeat modern way through mixed media. And how important is it to you to be able to showcase these stories and to really storytell? I mean, you've received much notoriety by being able to do this through Blind Tom and by Blind Boone. How important is it for you to be able to tell these stories?
Well, I guess it's of utmost importance. And basically, when I became a pianist, and I originally thought I was just going to be playing Chopin and Beethoven like hundreds and thousands of wonderful pianists out there, but this whole early interest in African American music and culture, which was formed in Providence, actually, and Providence was a big stop on the blues circuit in the 1970s, and I saw many of the great bluesmen here in Providence. I just felt that somehow it would be much more exciting and dynamic to be a pianist playing music influenced by this. And at the time, I didn't even know there was music out there that had this influence, but eventually, very soon, I found this was true. And I wanted to be much more of a kind of a modern performer. I didn't want to just be playing music by people who had died 250
really
years
ago.
As much as that music is fantastic. But I felt this would be a much more dynamic way to be a pianist in the late 20th and early 21st century. And part and parcel of that was also including visual elements, and there's often at my concerts video projected and things like this that makes it a visual experience as well as a musical experience.
Do you think that really grabs people's attention as we are becoming more of a visual society, and you know, attention spans aren't really as long as they used
Yes.
to be. You know, you're really changing things up from that classical experience. You're really on that forefront of being able to grab people's attention.
Yes, I mean, I think definitely in this time, having visual component to a performance is almost become, you know, absolutely imperative at this point. It's done now, even though I was doing it a long time ago, it's now done by lots of people. But I think I have the advantage of also being able to project images that are absolutely you know, riveting to look at too. It just happens to be this field has lots of wonderful imagery in it that produces all kinds of reactions in the audience, both you know, a sense of wow, these are beautiful images, but also wow, that's really you know, an appalling racially charged image. And so there's this constant tug going on at a concert that you might see me do.
Well, and what's really fascinating is that you have been able to tell these stories that may have been lost once before, and you're able to do it in a classical but modern kind of way, which is so fascinating and really appreciative. And I'm kind of wondering, do you think that music really is a powerful way to be able to keep the history alive and to keep storytelling alive?
I think it's a particularly powerful way because in the case of, say, Blind Tom, who was a slave, you know, there are thousands of stories out there of African Americans who were enslaved, who were exploited, and all kinds of things that can be told. But when you can also present this amazing music that he composed and he published, there were over 35 published pieces of his, and people come to this concert and say, how come I never knew about this person? It's an absolutely visceral way to connect people to his story, which they may not be that interested in otherwise.
Yeah. And then continuing that discussion, do you think that music and shows like this and exhibits like this are a good way to continue that conversation about race?
Yes, and especially in this day and age, this exhibit comes at a particularly fraught time in American history. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement is simmering, and you know, we've just come off the first African American president. We have the most racially charged campaign in history, maybe, and so these stories it's important to keep this kind of thing out, you know, subject matter out before the public. And for me as a pianist, I always say that I'm not actually that interested in the piano. I'm interested in the piano as a springboard into discussing issues that truly interest me, which are you know, issues of race and the country still grappling with its segregated past, and to draw attention to African American performers that have been unfairly relegated to the musical junk heap. And many of these early figures, both white and black, have been forgotten because their music was never recorded, and it also was in some unusual sort of world that brought together classical music with popular culture that for many years was sort of considered denigrated in American culture. And now these kind of things are being brought back, and I'm happy to be part of that.
We're happy that you are part of it, and happy to have you here in Providence. Looking forward to it. The symposium is April 11th, which is Tuesday.
Yes,
so
at 2 p.m. at the, now I'm going to say, it's at Fawn's house at Brown University. I think it's called the Pederuti Lounge or something like that.
Okay.
And it's going to feature two other scholars, a man named Eric Lott, who wrote maybe the definitive book about white minstrel shows, and a woman named Brandy Monk Payton, who's written about all kinds of the depiction of blacks in all kinds of media culture.
It sounds absolutely fascinating. We're so glad that you could join us here in studio today. He drove a long way in the pouring rain.
All the way from New York.
All the way from New York. So we're happy to have you and have this conversation. We
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much, John Davis here. If you are interested, Bambula is happening on Thursday, the symposium, but you can catch
Tuesday,
it.
the symposium.
Sorry.
And
we're getting all confused on it.
And the exhibition is up through May 5th.
Yeah, so if you can't
at
make
the
it to
John
the
Hay
symposium.
Library, and it's open Monday through Friday, and you can go see the exhibit anytime through May 5th.
So thank you so much. We really